Welcome to our Edward DeVere and William Shakespeare BN. Who was the real Shakespeare? Let's find out.
To start off, my first contention, I'll be talking about how Shakespeare didn't really take Edward DeVere's writing, because there's no way that Edward DeVere left 12 years of poetry or literature in general just for Shakespeare to come and steal out of nowhere. You'd have to be very creative and motivated to your work to have that much work built up after your death. So I personally don't believe that William Shakespeare stole Edward DeVere's writing work, because William Shakespeare's death was 12 years after Edward DeVere's, and that's a long time for people to be considering that he stole Edward DeVere's work. In my second contention, I'll be talking about William Shakespeare, how he was the greatest poet, actor, dramatist, etc., and a little bit of his background. He was considered like one of the greatest poets because of all the plays and sonnets that he's written. 32 plays and 154 sonnets. Shakespeare wasn't like Edward DeVere because he wasn't fancy or grew up in royalty, and he wasn't in a lot of athletics, so to say. He was just in grammar school. He wasn't really there to play sports, or he didn't really have fun with any friends or anything. He just sort of kept to himself. His main occupation was a player in plays and a share in an acting troupe. My third contention is about how Shakespeare grew up differently from Edward DeVere. He started off with a brother that was older than him. Then later on, his parents had 7 other kids. 2 of them died at infancy, 2 more died at a young kid age, and 2 of them died at a young adult age. That's 6 of his siblings gone. And that's kind of a lot, just to go through your whole lifetime, see all your brothers and sisters die before you. William Shakespeare was a businessman in his early adulthood. From either 18 or 20 years old was when he started working, and he started off by writing plays for a play company. He then had part ownership in that play company, and all the money that he earned, he spent it on his family to keep them in the position that they were in, living in Stratford-upon-Avon. And that leaves it for my intentions.
I have some questions to ask you. You say that Shakespeare grew up he had a rough childhood. Do you think that could have affected anything in his life? Like, of course, it must have been traumatizing, of course, but would you think that might have sparked, in his role in writing poems, writing sonnets, writing plays? Do you think that had, any effect?
Okay, I see some of his work was sparked by the death of his siblings, but some of it was just mostly because he lived on the countryside of England. He grew up writing about plants and animals, and that's what he expressed mostly when he was growing up. But later on in life, he started writing about love, death, war, Italy, this is his most popular one, etc. And next question?
Okay. The last question is, as you said, you stated about war, love, and especially Italy. My final question to you is, did he travel at all during his lifetime? Could he have possibly seen many aspects and seen different parts of the world? So basically, did he travel?
From the research I've done, he didn't travel as much as he wanted to, or as much as people believed he did. He traveled to maybe India, and maybe that's it, from the research that I've documented. But is that it?
So you're just telling me that he didn't travel a lot?
He didn't travel a lot that we know of. Not all of it is recorded, but for the most part, All I know is he traveled to India and places around London, England.
Okay. In this debate between Shakespeare and DeVere, I will be taking over the Edward DeVere case. In my first contention, I would like to bring Shakespeare's background. From what we know, Shakespeare doesn't have much of a background. We knew that he grew up around England in the little town of Stratford, but there is really no documentation about William Shakespeare's life. What we do know is where he was born, but we don't know what day he was born. We know what year he was born, but we just don't know what day. Which is kind of fascinating because the first thing that when people are looking you up, you want to know what day they were born. But William Shakespeare doesn't have that. And that seems a little bit off, but hey, who am I to judge? During Shakespeare's life, his father was a leather worker. And he himself, later in life, William Shakespeare became a businessman himself. With documentations being said, during William Shakespeare's life, there are only possibly 3 documents that have his actual signature written in them. It's kind of funny how all throughout your life, all the papers and all the things that an adult would need to do are non-existent. There's no documents, there's no signature, there's really no proof that he was even an actual person, which doesn't make sense. When we talk about Edward DeVere, we're talking huge. He had all the background. He had a 500-page thesis written on him about all his life's work, his poems, his sonnets that he's ever written throughout his life. He has actual documentation of everything. Edward DeVere wrote his own version of the Geneva Bible. And now that we look at that Bible and the verses that he wrote in it, Edward Shakespeare actually made marks about it in his works. In my next intention, I would like to bring up Shakespeare's education. Shakespeare has no education or whatsoever. His education isn't even documented, which in this case is really bad. William Shakespeare never owned any books, he never wrote any manuscripts. There is no information that we could gather about William Shakespeare. As we said, Shakespeare didn't own any books. Most importantly, Shakespeare was literate and was raised in an illiterate family. And as I said, DeVere had the proper credentials. By the age of 14, Edward DeVere graduated from Cambridge University. And at 16, he was known as a Master of Arts. And then later on in life, he studied law and graduated from Gray's Inn. So based off that information, we know that Edward DeVere is well educated and William Shakespeare's not. And when you look back at the works, plays, and sonnets that were written, Edward DeVere fits that category because he was well educated. And as for William Shakespeare, there's no evidence that he could have ever written that stuff if he never went to school. In my third contention, I will be talking about the style, the writings, and mostly just the artwork itself that has been created throughout history. The main point is that William Shakespeare and Edward DeVere had similar writing styles. And Shakespeare's identified one category after another. Edward DeVere had the same characteristics that were projected onto Shakespeare's work, and most importantly, a knowledge of Italy. Shakespeare's never been to Italy, as I should say, and DeVere has. So if Shakespeare wrote about Italy but has never gone to Italy, how could one project the ideas into the styles of plays and poems? It doesn't add up. Talking about Italy, DeVere spent a whole year in Italy in 1575. With DeVere living in Italy and going there for a very long amount of time, it's kind of funny because 14 of Shakespeare's plays have an Italian setting. And if 14 of his plays have an Italian setting and he's never been there, so the main question is, who wrote it? And that leads to DeVere. My last point was that they have a lot of similarities in their style and their wordplay. In Venus and Adonis, written by Shakespeare, you could clearly see that he used a 6-line pentameter. And the only person to have ever written in a 6-line pentameter before Shakespeare was Edward DeVere. Edward de Vere was one of the first of many poets to have ever written in a six-line pentameter. So once Shakespeare starts to use it, it just kind of seems odd because they are the only two poets that are writing in a six-line pentameter. But that's not it. Their sonnets have a way deeper connection. Edward de Vere's and Vavassor's Echo and Shakespeare's work of Dark Lady were both composed for the same person, Anne Vavassor. Since they both composed artwork for the same person, that kind of leads to the question, was Shakespeare a real human being? Did he actually write all his work? Or was it just a ruse brought upon by Edward de Vere? And that rests my case.
Okay, the first question for you is, what did Edward de Vere write about? Like, in his poetry, what did he write about?
You say, what did de Vere ever write about? Well, they both wrote about this. Both Edward de Vere had the same projection that Shakespeare had, except Edward de Vere wrote about it first. Edward de Vere wrote a lot about Italy. Edward de Vere also wrote a bunch of his work around a love-hate relationship, symphony, and especially classic education. Both Edward de Vere and William Shakespeare, they both had the same ideas of what to write about. Both William Shakespeare and Edward de Vere both composed the same literary aspects, but Edward de Vere wrote them first.
And my last question is, was most of Edward de Vere's background documented, saved, recorded?
Yeah, they were recorded in that 500-page thesis. So most of his life, he knew a lot of people in a lot of different areas. He knew people that were part of the military during that time, and he even had people that were in royalty that would tell Edward de Vere about their lives. So when you look back at like Shakespeare's poems, you can kind of see Edward de Vere's life reflect upon them because he grew around royalty, he's seen Italy, and he's seen a bunch of aspects. There are a bunch of aspects in de Vere's life that create the artwork, that create his artwork, and that could possibly be projected by Shakespeare.
Okay, and that's all I got for you.
Thank you.
To respond to your first point about Shakespeare's background, Shakespeare had a background, just some wasn't documented. I mean, most of it was like his writing, his education, about his business, when he took part in business. Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon. He does not have a recorded birth date, but he does have a recorded baptist date. His baptismal date was April 23rd, 1564. And his birthday has to be somewhere close by because in the old English days, they would baptize babies right away, almost as soon as they came out of the womb, almost. So maybe about a 2-week span or so. Later on, when Shakespeare was 6 years old, his father, John Shakespeare, put him into Stratford Grammar School. There he was there until the age of 14, and as soon as he got out of grammar school, he kind of wrote a little bit more about the countryside, about animals and plants, as I stated to his questions, and it just kind of showed that he was a normal countryside boy, that he was just writing plain old poetry. And he wasn't really taken seriously during his young adult years. He was in business in his early adult years with the play company. And after Edward de Vere died, his work started kind of floating around, getting known. And so people started thinking that Shakespeare was, and so since Shakespeare's work was similar to Edward de Vere's, people started thinking that Shakespeare was stealing some of Edward de Vere's work. After Edward de Vere's death, his work started to get noticeable, floating around, and people started getting suspicious because his work was fairly similar to Shakespeare's. But Shakespeare was still alive and he was still writing. But, however, Shakespeare was still alive 12 years. Shakespeare was still alive after Edward de Vere's death, and he was still working on sonnets, some plays, and it's not really provable that William Shakespeare took Edward de Vere's work. So it's all up to you to decide, and that's all I got.
Okay. So in the last point that you brought up, you kind of talked about how William Shakespeare outlived Edward de Vere. And yeah, that's true. That's a very good point. But one thing that you also have to notice and realize is that how could you know that Edward de Vere just didn't leave him any poems, any sonnets, any plays just laying around given to William Shakespeare? It's important to know that Edward de Vere had the possibility of giving William Shakespeare the content to carry out even after he had died. Another point that you brought was William Shakespeare's writing being similar to Edward de Vere's. And yes, it was very similar. But what I kind of don't get was that, backtracking, Shakespeare had all this information, but who was really there to give it to him? Like, he talked about war. Who gave him those ideas? He talked about the royalty position. Who in royalty was there to supply him that information? And the way that he lived in the outskirts of London, that's not really possible. It's not possible to come up with all that information, especially since he only went to grammar school. Okay, I will give the fact, grammar school is still school, but he didn't go to college, he didn't go to a university. So I'm pretty sure he's not that smart or has the capabilities of knowing the people around him to supply with that information. Another thing that I would like to point out is William Shakespeare's will. William Shakespeare's will is documented, but there's nothing to prove. William Shakespeare wrote almost nothing in his will. He didn't give it to his children. He didn't write anything. So if William Shakespeare kind of wrote nothing on his will and didn't leave anything, that kind of just sets it up to like he wasn't an actual person. Like, he didn't leave any of his work. He didn't leave anything. It was just randomly discovered after he had passed away. His will kind of doesn't prove anything. William Shakespeare didn't have a legacy, and as if you pointed out, he didn't gather everyone's attention. So what kind of changed that? What kind of changed people's perspectives? Hey, let's look at this guy. Let's see what he actually did in life. Because his whole life, he lived as a mystery. And as for Edward de Vere, all that information is out there. He wrote a will. Everything that he ever wrote was passed down. It was available to everybody. And he stands as a true definition of leaving a legacy. And therefore, I believe that Edward de Vere is a true Shakespeare. And that ends my case.
To respond to your first question about how do we know that Edward de Vere didn't leave work for Shakespeare to use? And in my defense, William Shakespeare didn't travel a lot, and he didn't really know about Edward de Vere at the moment. And so how would he know about Edward de Vere's work and where to get it from? And how would he be so close to him? If he was so close to him, they would have been documented his friends, recorded his friends, and it would have been, this theory would not even be existent. Responding to your second question, Shakespeare didn't really like being social, or he was just kind of like a quiet kid. He kept to himself and some of his work to himself, other than the plays when he was doing business with a play company. To wrap this all up, Edward de Vere and William Shakespeare, to me, are two different people. I think Edward de Vere is the fancy side of England. Shakespeare is just not the peasant, but like the normal people of England. So I believe William Shakespeare was a true author of his own work. Edward de Vere was a true author of his own work. Since they're both two different people, William Shakespeare's legacy should remain to be unquestionable. And that's it.
Well, thanks for watching our debate on William Shakespeare and Edward de Vere. Hope you guys enjoyed.